was just after dawn when the sky over Crestwood Hollow turned a pale shade of gold, casting long shadows across the sleepy town's dew-covered streets. And as most of the town slowly stirred to life, Officer Daniel Mercer took his usual patrol route down Route 9, sipping lukewarm coffee from his travel mug and listening to the soothing low static of the radio, never expecting that today would be anything other than uneventful, until out of the corner of his eye he noticed a blur of movement, low to the ground, fast and seemingly frantic, darting from the edge of the forest and straight into the middle of the road, causing him to slam the brakes with a jolt that sent his coffee spilling into the cup holder and his heart racing. It was a dog, a large, soot-colored shepherd mix, its coat matted and eyes wild with desperation. And as Daniel leaned forward, the dog didn't run away as many strays might. Instead, it planted itself directly in front of the cruiser, barking loudly and pawing at the air, not with aggression, but urgency, a kind of pleading that Daniel, a lifelong dog owner himself, immediately recognized not as random barking, but a cry for help. And the strange thing wasn't just that the dog was so insistent, but that it kept glancing back over its shoulder toward the dense forest it had come from, as if trying to say, "Follow me." And after a few moments of this back and forth, barking, glancing, stepping toward the trees and back again, Daniel made the split-second decision to turn on his emergency lights, radio in a possible injured animal call, and step out of the cruiser slowly, keeping his hands visible and his posture low, speaking in a calm voice. "Hey there, buddy. You okay? What's going on, huh?" And the dog, whose tagless collar was worn and frayed, turned sharply and darted back toward the woods, pausing only once to make sure Daniel was following before disappearing into the underbrush with surprising speed. And something in the way it moved, not random, not panicked, but purposeful, made Daniel's instincts flare with a mix of curiosity and concern. So he grabbed his flashlight and ventured after the dog, his boots crunching through last autumn's brittle leaves as birds scattered in the canopy above. And as he weaved through the thickening brush, occasionally catching sight of that black and silver tail ahead, the air grew cooler, the light dimmer, and the path more uneven, until he reached a small clearing where the dog had stopped completely, sitting and staring at something beyond the brush, something Daniel couldn't see until he stepped forward and spotted what made his breath hitch. A minivan, its front end crumpled around an old oak, steam still hissing from the engine and half hidden by vines and branches, as if the forest had tried to swallow it whole. And sprawled just outside the driver's door was a woman, unconscious or worse, with a young boy, maybe 6, maybe 7, sitting beside her with silent tears running down his dirt-smudged face, clutching her hand like a lifeline. And Daniel's training kicked in before his emotions could, shouting into the radio for EMS, for backup, for road closure at Route 9 near mile marker 22. And as he knelt beside the woman to check for a pulse, faint, but there, the dog came closer and sat beside the boy, leaning gently into him, licking his cheek once, as if to say, "It's okay now." And Daniel realized in that moment that this wasn't just a random stray, but a protector, a guardian who had stayed with the crash all night, maybe longer, and only left when he understood that the woman wasn't waking up, and the child had cried himself into exhausted silence. The dog had gone for help, had somehow navigated the woods and found the road, and picked the right cruiser to flag down. And by the time other officers and paramedics arrived, sealing off the road and carving a new path through the underbrush with stretchers and supplies, the dog stayed close, never aggressive, never leaving the boy's side, even when they loaded the woman into the ambulance and promised Daniel she'd make it with time and care. And when one of the medics tried to lead the child away, he shook his head violently and pointed at the dog. "Shadow comes too," he cried, and the name struck Daniel like lightning, because now he remembered there'd been an Amber Alert 3 days ago for a missing mother and son from a town 40 miles away. Last seen driving a silver van matching the wreck, almost exactly. And as dispatch confirmed the match, and Shadow curled up on the floor of the ambulance beside the boy, the entire crew grew quiet with awe, realizing they hadn't just witnessed a rescue. They'd been part of a story that would ripple through the town for weeks to come. And as the road remained closed for investigation, and the news crews gathered by the barriers later that afternoon, Daniel stood quietly near his cruiser, watching Shadow, freshly fed, now with a bandaged paw, rest beside the reunited family at the hospital entrance, wondering how far the dog had run, how he'd known who to trust, and what unseen bond had driven him to protect that boy through thick woods and long nights, until help arrived. And Daniel knew, in his gut, in his soul, that not all heroes wear badges or drive cars with sirens. Some have fur and silent loyalty, and eyes that burn with purpose under the glow of the morning sun. Or perhaps when the full moon rises over Crestwood Hollow, and the legends of old whisper through the trees, maybe a dog like Shadow isn't just a dog at all, but something more, something ancient, something born of the wild heart of wolves and the gentle soul of family, something meant to guide the lost home when all seems dark. And as Daniel walked back to his cruiser that evening, with the road still blocked behind him and the scent of pine heavy in the air, he looked back one last time and saw Shadow glance his way, tail thumping once, as if in quiet thanks, before turning back to the boy he had risked everything for. And Daniel smiled, whispering, "Good job, buddy," to the wind as it carried the story onward into the coming night. As the sun dipped behind the hills, and the twilight shadows stretched long and lean across Crestwood Hollow, casting a soft lavender hue over the sleepy town, Officer Daniel Mercer sat in his cruiser long after his shift had ended, staring at the road where Shadow had first appeared. unable to shake the feeling that the dog had not only saved a life that morning, but had rewritten the story of everyone involved, including Daniel himself. And while the world outside slowly moved on, with the van towed away, the forest quiet again, and the police tape fluttering in the gentle evening breeze, something inside Daniel had changed. Some ember of awe and purpose, lit anew by a dog that had defied all odds and logic to become a legend in real time. And he found himself driving not home, but toward the hospital, just to check in, just to make sure the story hadn't unraveled with time or distance. But when he arrived, he found the little boy, now identified as Elijah Cole, asleep beside his mother's bed, hand still curled in hers, monitors humming steadily as color had returned to her cheeks. And Shadow, ever present, lay like a sentinel on the tile floor, his eyes open and calm, watching everyone who entered, not with suspicion, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had a job to do and wasn't done doing it yet. And when Daniel walked in, Shadow stood up slowly, his tail giving a single slow wag, then sat down again, as if to say, "You're okay, I remember you." And Daniel knelt down and scratched gently behind Shadow's ears, feeling the wiry softness of a coat that had seen storms, brush, hunger, and still held warmth. And though Shadow never made a sound, his eyes spoke volumes, telling Daniel stories he'd never hear from any mouth. And over the next few days, as word spread through local news and social media, the story of the dog who sought help, who closed a road, who saved a mother and child, bloomed into something bigger than anyone could have imagined, with people across the state sending supplies, asking to adopt Shadow, offering rewards and donations. But when it came time to make decisions, Elijah, now safe, now beginning to smile again, said with quiet, unshakable certainty, "He's my dog." And no one could argue, not even the rescue shelters or well-meaning strangers, because Shadow had chosen Elijah just as surely as Elijah now claimed him. And the bond between them became a kind of anchor, a lifeline that stretched backward through the woods and wreckage, and into something unbreakable. And as Daniel checked in often, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not, he got to know their story in more detail. How the accident had happened during a storm, the van slipping on a rain-slick turn, how no one had seen them veer off the road and into the woods, how the GPS had failed and cell service died, and how Shadow had appeared just a few hours before the crash, trotting along the roadside alone, wet, lost, but tail wagging faintly as if drawn by some unseen thread to the van when it skidded, and how he'd stayed, night after night, lying beside Elijah to keep him warm, nudging the mother when she moaned, fetching water from a nearby puddle, and even barking at a passing bear once to keep it at bay. And though no one could explain where Shadow had come from, not fully, no chip, no collar with a number, no missing dog reports matching his description, it was almost as if he had come from the woods themselves, born of the moonlight and earth, summoned by some ancient call that only children and animals could hear. And Daniel, despite his years of logic and reason, began to believe that maybe some things weren't meant to be explained, but simply witnessed, treasured, passed on like folklore wrapped in fact. And by the time the hospital cleared the mother, Joanna, to return home, the three of them, Joanna, Elijah, and Shadow, had become inseparable. The dog walking faithfully beside Elijah's wheelchair during recovery, nuzzling Joanna's hand when she felt overwhelmed, always watching, always ready. And when they returned to their small home in the neighboring county, it was Daniel who drove them, personally, not because it was protocol, but because something in him needed to see them safe, needed to watch them return to a life they almost lost. And Shadow, as if sensing the significance, rode quietly in the back seat beside Elijah, eyes fixed on the horizon, tail brushing the boy's arm every so often. And as they pulled into the gravel driveway of a weather-worn house nestled between two maple trees, something about the scene, the wind in the leaves, the smell of distant rain, the way Shadow jumped out and immediately circled the yard like he was claiming it, felt right. And Daniel promised he'd visit again soon. And he did, often, bringing chew toys, treats, sometimes just stories. And every time he came, Shadow greeted him with that same slow tail wag and thoughtful gaze. And over the months that followed, Shadow became something of a town legend, not just in Crestwood Hollow, but all over the county, appearing in newspapers, being painted by a local artist in a mural near the park, even featured in a children's book written by a retired teacher who had been inspired by the tale. And wherever he went, children would point and whisper, "That's Shad." It was just after dawn, when the sky over Crestwood Hollow turned a pale shade of gold, casting long shadows across the sleepy town's dew-covered streets. And as most of the town slowly stirred to life, Officer Daniel Mercer took his usual patrol route down Route 9, sipping lukewarm coffee from his travel mug and listening to the soothing low static of the radio, never expecting that today would be anything other than uneventful, until out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a blur of movement, low to the ground, fast and seemingly frantic, darting from the edge of the forest and straight into the middle of the road, causing him to slam the brakes with a jolt that sent his coffee spilling into the cup holder and his heart racing. It was a dog, a large, soot-colored shepherd mix, its coat matted and eyes wild with desperation. And as Daniel leaned forward, the dog didn't run away as many strays might. Instead, it planted itself directly in front of the cruiser, barking loudly and pawing at the air, not with aggression, but urgency, a kind of pleading that Daniel, a lifelong dog owner himself, immediately recognized not as random barking, but a cry for help. And the strange thing wasn't just that the dog was so insistent, but that it kept glancing back over its shoulder toward the dense forest it had come from, as if trying to say, "Follow me." And after a few moments of this back and forth, barking, glancing, stepping toward the trees and back again, Daniel made the split-second decision to turn on his emergency lights, radio in a possible injured animal call, and step out of the cruiser slowly, keeping his hands visible and his posture low, speaking in a calm voice. "Hey there, buddy. You okay?" The rescue dog. But fame never changed him. He remained quiet, watchful, preferring the company of Elijah to crowds, never straying far from his side. And when Elijah began walking again, limping at first, then stronger, it was Shadow who walked with him every day, pacing himself carefully, stopping when Elijah needed to rest, nudging him forward when he needed courage. And when Joanna, now stronger and working from home, would look out the window and see the two of them in the yard, her heart would swell with a kind of gratitude that went deeper than words. The kind that knew she'd been given more than a second chance. She'd been given a protector, a guardian, a friend unlike any other. And one crisp autumn evening, nearly a year after the crash, she invited Daniel over for dinner, and they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills, the air golden and cool, and Shadow lay between them, head on his paws, listening as they shared stories, laughter, and a silence that said more than conversation ever could. And Daniel, looking out at the fading light, finally asked the question he'd carried all this time. "Do you think he was meant for you, that he found you for a reason?" And Joanna, her eyes soft, simply nodded and whispered, "I think he was meant for all of us." And as the first stars blinked into the sky, and the moon rose full and white over the ridge, casting a glow across the yard, Shadow stood up, walked to Elijah, and lay down beside him, tail thumping once before settling into stillness. And though no one said it aloud, they all felt it, the closing of a chapter, the gentle turning of a page. And in that moment, with the moon high and the wind whispering through the trees, the legend of Shadow became something more than a story. It became a memory etched in the hearts of everyone who knew him, and long after he grew gray, and his muzzle turned silver like the name he carried, long after his paws no longer chased through grass, but dreams, his legacy lived on in the boy who learned courage from a dog, in the woman who found strength in loyalty, and in the officer who discovered that not all calls for help come through radios. Some come through barks in the early morning light, through eyes that pierce through doubt and fear, and through footsteps that never hesitate to run into the unknown. And when the day finally came, many seasons later, when Shadow laid his head on Elijah's lap for the last time, the boy, now a young man, with strong hands and tears in his eyes, the whole town remembered. The schools rang their bells once in his honor. The mural was crowned with fresh flowers, and Daniel, now a chief, led the short but heartfelt ceremony beneath the maple trees, whispering the same words he'd said so long ago on the forest road. "Good job, buddy," as the wind carried the tale of the dog who begged for help and saved a world reminding all who heard it that sometimes the truest stories are the ones written not with ink, but with paw prints on hearts. And though the road had long reopened, and the forest stood silent again, every now and then, on nights when the moon glows bright, and the leaves rustle just right, some say they still see him, a silhouette in silver, watching, waiting, guarding the edge of the woods, a legend not gone, but running forever through the soul of Crestwood Hollow. Years passed like the wind that rustles through dry leaves, subtle but relentless, carrying the echoes of a moment that had once changed everything. And in the quiet town of Crestwood Hollow, life moved forward gently, the seasons turning like pages in a book well loved and never forgotten. Yet even as new faces moved into old houses and children grew into teenagers riding bikes down familiar roads, the story of Shadow never dimmed. It became part of the town's fabric, stitched into every whispered tale told at dusk, and every mural that appeared in chalk on sidewalks when spring finally touched the earth. And though the town expanded little by little, pushing slowly outward toward the forests where it all began, the stretch of Route 9 near mile marker 22 remained hallowed ground, a place locals still pointed at with reverence, saying that's where Shadow stopped the police cruiser. And sometimes people left flowers at the base of the tree that had caught Joanna's van, not out of mourning, but remembrance, a ritual that seemed to say, we haven't forgotten. And truly, they hadn't, especially not Elijah, who grew up with Shadow as more than a pet, more than even a best friend. He was a guardian, a brother of sorts, the very anchor to a life that might have otherwise drifted into silence. And as Elijah matured his body, no longer weak from that long ago crash, but tall, strong, and agile, he often found himself sitting at the edge of the forest behind their home, Shadow beside him, both of them listening to the wind in the trees, the call of distant birds, and something deeper, something older, a feeling that there was still more to come, something unfinished, something waiting beyond the veil of their peaceful days. And Elijah would speak sometimes, not expecting an answer, sharing his worries about school, about fitting in, about the strange dreams he had dreams where he was running barefoot through the woods under moonlight, always chasing something just out of reach, and always, just at the edge of his vision, was a great silver wolf, watching him, waiting, not menacing but majestic. And when he told Joanna about it, she would smile that soft, knowing smile she wore whenever Shadow curled at her feet and say, maybe it's just your heart remembering something your mind can't explain. And that was enough for a while. But as Elijah approached his 17th birthday, the dreams grew stronger, more vivid, and Shadow, though now gray-muzzled and slow-moving, began to change too, growing restless on certain nights, pacing the porch and staring out toward the hills, ears twitching at sounds no human could hear. And one night, just after the first frost of autumn, Elijah woke to find Shadow gone, his bed cold and empty, the door scratched slightly open, and panic shot through him like lightning as he pulled on boots and raced outside, calling Shadow's name into the crisp air. But there was no answer, just silence and the soft hiss of wind through the trees, until just past the ridge where the woods began, he found paw prints in the frost, not just shadows, but larger ones, wilder ones, impossibly big for any known dog. And something inside Elijah told him to follow. And so he did, flashlight trembling in his hand, breath clouding before him like ghostly whispers. And deeper into the woods he went, retracing old paths he hadn't walked in years, until he reached the clearing, the very place where Shadow had once led Officer Mercer, where the wreck had been, where life had once teetered on a knife's edge. And there, in the center of the glade, stood Shadow, his head lifted, ears perked, and in front of him, silent and still as stone, was a great wolf, silver and moonlit, with eyes that burned like stars, and a presence that made Elijah freeze in place, not from fear, but awe. And the two animals regarded each other with a familiarity that defied logic, like long-lost kin reunited after lifetimes apart. And then, without a word or bark or growl, the wolf turned and vanished into the trees, leaving Shadow to slowly return to Elijah's side, lean into him, and guide him home. And when they reached the porch, Elijah turned to ask something, anything. But Shadow only looked up with those wise eyes and stepped inside, curling into his bed as if nothing had happened. And though Elijah lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it, a strange peace had settled over him, a sense that something had been revealed, not fully understood, but unveiled like the corner of a great cosmic truth. And over the following weeks, life resumed its pace. School, homework, coffee with Daniel, who was now something of an uncle figure in Elijah's life, still with that same quiet integrity and growing streaks of gray at his temples. And on the day of Elijah's graduation, Shadow walked with him across the small stage they'd set up outdoors, tail wagging slowly. And the crowd stood and clapped, not just for the boy, but the dog who had been with him every step of the way. And later that summer, when the stars were bright and the moon full, Shadow didn't wake up, passing in his sleep beneath the same maple trees he had guarded all those years. His body curled beside Elijah's bed, his breath fading like the final line of a well-told story. And the loss was profound, heavy, a silence that rang through the halls of their home. But it wasn't just sorrow, it was gratitude, a celebration of a life that had been larger than words. And the town, once more, came together, planting a tree in the park where children now played beside a bronze statue of Shadow, lifelike and regal, eyes ever fixed on the horizon. And Elijah, now a young man with a calmness that set him apart from his peers, felt called toward something greater, not fame or fortune, but something deeper, rooted in that night in the woods, in the dreams he still sometimes had. And so he went away for a time, not to escape, but to learn, studying wildlife biology and rescue training, driven by the quiet mission of honoring what Shadow had given him. And he worked with search dogs, learned their language, their body cues, their loyalty, their grief, and their joy. And every time he felt unsure, he would whisper Shadow's name into the wind and feel a strange warmth at his back, a guiding presence. And when he returned to Crestwood Hollow, it was not with fanfare but purpose, starting a small canine search and rescue team named Silver Watch, a nod to the wolf in his dreams, and the dog who had once stood between life and death. And Daniel, now nearing retirement, helped him secure the land, train the recruits, write the grants, and often sat beside him on long evenings when training ended and the stars came out, talking softly about how some dogs come into our lives to change it, and some come to save it. And Elijah agreed, always, because he knew that Shadow had done both, and more. And on one such night, many years later, when Elijah himself had grown into a man with streaks of gray in his hair, he sat on the same porch with his own daughter on his lap, telling her the story, not the watered-down version, but the full truth of the wreck, the road, the forest, and the dog who ran for help, who stayed through the darkest nights, who closed down a road and opened the door to a new life. And as she listened with wide eyes, clutching a stuffed toy shaped like a shepherd, the moon rose once more over the woods, and from the distance there came a single long howl, not mournful, but proud, deep, and echoing through the trees. And Elijah closed his eyes, smiled, and said, "He's still watching." And in that moment, under the silver glow of the moon, past and present blurred, and the legacy of a dog named Shadow lived on, not just in memory, not just in statues or stories, but in every step Elijah took, in every rescue made, in every child saved from danger, in every howl carried on the wind, a legend passed down not as myth, but as truth, etched not in stone, but in hearts, where it would live forever, as long as stories were told under moonlight, and the paw prints of heroes were never forgotten. Years flowed onward like a slow, wide river, carrying with them the echoes of laughter, the warmth of memories, and the quiet ache of those who once walked beside us, but now lived only in dreams and stories. And in the little town of Crestwood Hollow, now known to more people than ever thanks to the legend of Shadow, life had evolved without losing its heart. The park had grown into a community hub with carved benches, children's playgrounds, and plaques beneath trees planted in honor of fallen companions, including one that bore the simple inscription, "In loyalty, love, and courage, Shadow, the one who ran for help." And in the nearby Silver Watch facility, built from the ground up by Elijah and his close-knit team, dogs of every kind, from stocky golden retrievers to nimble border collies, to quiet, watchful mutts with pasts full of mystery, trained beside young handlers who had all heard the story of Shadow, who had all felt the call of that deep bond between human and dog, and who all knew, whether by dream or instinct, But this work was more than rescue. It was sacred, and Elijah, now in his early 40s with weathered hands and gentle eyes, still moved with the quiet grace of someone who carried a great love and loss, not as a burden, but as a torch. And every time he led a training through the forest, still untouched on the outer edges of Crestwood, he would pause at the glade where the van once crashed, a small hand-carved wooden figure of shadow resting at the base of the old tree, and bow his head for a moment, not in mourning, but in respect. For this was where everything began, where the road met the wild, and where a dog became something eternal. And though he'd since married a woman named Harper, who was both sharp and soft in the best ways, and had a daughter named Sylvie, who carried the spirit of both her father and Shadow in the way she moved and listened, and always seemed to know when someone needed comfort. There was not a single day Elijah didn't feel the ghost of Paws beside him, the memory of warm fur brushing his knee. And sometimes, on nights when the wind picked up just so, he'd see Sylvie stop mid-play and look toward the tree line, smile, and whisper, "He's watching again." And Elijah would nod, unable to speak around the lump in his throat, because deep down he believed she was right, that Shadow had never truly left, that perhaps dogs like him didn't go the way of time and ash, but instead became something else, something woven into the world itself. And as Sylvie grew, showing a remarkable talent with animals and a deep, uncanny sensitivity to their needs, Harper and Elijah both wondered aloud whether it was simply genetics or something more. A gift, perhaps, passed down not by blood, but by bond. And when Sylvie turned 10, she was given her own companion, a rescue dog named Rune, a quiet, pale-eyed shepherd mix who had been found half-starved near the same woods Shadow once vanished into. And from the moment Sylvie laid eyes on Rune, something old stirred between them, like pages of a story turning themselves, and they became inseparable, walking the woods together for hours, whispering secrets, laughing in the shadows of trees as birds flitted above them. And Elijah, watching from the porch, often felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as though watching an echo of his own childhood unfold again, not identically, but harmoniously, like verses of a poem answering each other across time. And life was good, full of love and growth, and the quiet satisfaction that came from doing meaningful work. But of course, life never remains still for long, and one evening, as twilight smeared pink and orange across the sky, and the forest breathed deep with the cooling of day, a distress call came into the Silver Watch facility. A hiker, possibly injured, had vanished in the Deep Stone Preserve, a wilder, more treacherous stretch of forest beyond the town's limits. And while search teams had combed the area with drones and ATVs, the canopy was too thick, the terrain too broken, and Elijah, without hesitation, readied a team, 3 dogs, 4 handlers, and Sylvie, now 13 and an official junior handler, who stood at the ready with Rune beside her, silent and focused. And though Harper hesitated, her heart pounding as she looked at her daughter, a mirror of herself and the boy she once met, she saw the steady calm in Sylvie's eyes and let her go with a kiss to her forehead and a whispered, "Trust Rune and trust yourself." And into the woods they went, flashlights bobbing, radios crackling, boots crunching over moss and fallen leaves, the darkness rising slowly like a tide. And the search stretched long into the night, with Rune suddenly pulling Sylvie away from the main path, nose to the ground, ears forward, ignoring commands to slow down. And Sylvie, trusting the dog without hesitation, followed, ducking under branches, leaping small creeks, deeper and deeper into the forest, until all sounds of the others fell away, and only the forest remained alive, ancient, watching. And suddenly Rune stopped dead in her tracks, ears back, eyes fixed ahead. And in the gloom, barely visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, stood a massive silver wolf, not wild, not afraid, but calm, regal, and familiar in a way that made Sylvie's breath catch in her throat. And Rune did not growl or lunge, but simply lowered her head in a gesture of respect. And the wolf looked at Sylvie, and she understood, not in words, but in feeling, a deep knowing that pulsed in her chest like a second heartbeat. And without warning, the wolf turned and began to walk, and Sylvie followed, Rune close behind, her flashlight swinging gently by her side, but no longer needed. And the forest seemed to clear before them, branches moving as if stirred by invisible hands, until they came upon a narrow crevice, almost invisible to the untrained eye. And within it, barely conscious but alive, was the missing hiker, a young woman trapped by a fallen log, her ankle twisted badly, her lips cracked and voice hoarse as she whispered, How did you find me?" And Sylvie knelt beside her, checking her vitals just as she'd been trained. But in her heart, she wanted to say, "We didn't." He did, and as she radioed for help, the silver wolf vanished once more into the trees. No sound, no trail, just gone like mist in morning sun. And when the others arrived, and the woman was lifted into a stretcher and carried back toward safety, Elijah pulled Sylvie aside and asked what happened. And she told him honestly, without embellishment, and he didn't question it. He only knelt, hugged her tightly, and whispered, "He found you worthy." And they walked back in silence, hand in hand, Rune padding quietly beside them. And that night, beneath the stars, Elijah wrote in his journal, the one he kept all these years, filled with memories of shadow and the stories he never told aloud, and penned the final line, "The story never ends, it only changes its voice." And in the years that followed, as Sylvie grew into her own, as Rune aged and passed, and was buried beside the old maple tree where Shadow once rested, as Crestwood Hollow became not just a town, but a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in the bond between canine and kindred soul. Elijah stepped back from leading and watched, as Sylvie took up the mantle as her voice became the new one telling the story. And every time she ended her speeches with, "And that's how a dog once begged the police for help," the crowd would fall silent, hearts full, and somewhere, beyond the edge of reason and time, in the silver hush of moonlight on fur, shadow still ran through dreams, through hearts, through the very soil of the place where it all began, never gone, only waiting, only watching, always returning in the hour of need as seasons continued to spin. And the town of Crestwood Hollow thrived in its quiet legacy. The name Shadow was no longer just a memory whispered by locals or etched into plaques. It had become a symbol of something deeper, something that wove itself into the identity of everyone who stepped foot on that soil, and especially into the hearts of those who came to the Silver Watch Center not as visitors, but as seekers, those in search of healing, of purpose, or of a companion who would walk beside them through the darkest hours. And as Sylvie matured into her 20s, inheriting not just her father's calm strength, but also her mother's perceptiveness and quiet intuition, the center flourished under her leadership, evolving from a simple search and rescue operation into a sanctuary where wounded dogs and wounded people found one another in ways that defied science, but made perfect sense to the soul. And though Rune had long since passed, her collar still hung from Sylvie's bedroom mirror, the tag worn smooth by years of affection. And sometimes Sylvie would find herself running her fingers across it in moments of stillness, as if brushing against the veil between past and present, feeling again the heartbeat of the dog who had walked into the dark with her and come out carrying light. And while Elijah now spent most of his days tending the gardens behind the house or writing in his ever-growing series of journals, each one a quiet symphony of stories, sketches, and memories, he was never truly retired, for the essence of what he'd built lived on through his daughter, through the dogs, and through the quiet howl that still echoed through the woods on nights when the moon was full, and the trees stood like old sentinels beneath the stars. And one such night, when the air smelled like distant rain and wildflowers, a knock came at the gates of Silver Watch, not a dramatic pounding, but a soft, hesitant tapping. And Sylvie opened the door to find a boy of maybe 12 standing in the shadows with a backpack slung over one shoulder, his shoes worn and muddy, his hair sticking to his forehead in anxious tufts. And behind him stood a lanky dog with bones too visible beneath a matted coat, eyes too old for his age. And before Sylvie could ask a single question, the boy said in a trembling voice, "We followed the wolf." And she blinked once, twice, and felt a shiver ripple through her chest, not of fear, but recognition, the kind that comes when life drops a stone into the still pond of your reality, and the ripples rearrange everything. And without hesitation, she stepped aside and welcomed them in, offering food, warmth, and silence, knowing that some stories took time to bloom. And over the days that followed, the boy, whose name was Milo, began to speak, slowly, hesitantly, revealing a tale that seemed stitched from both nightmare and miracle. How he'd grown up in a foster system where he was often invisible, unwanted, shuffled between cold beds and colder stairs, and how the dog, whom he called Knox, had followed him one rainy afternoon when he'd finally decided to run, not from anything specific, but from everything. And how, in the woods beyond a place he couldn't name, they'd seen a wolf, not ordinary, not wild, but glowing faintly under the stormlight, silver and silent, who had paused just long enough for Knox to see, to scent, to understand something ancient, and then had vanished, leaving behind a trail of impossible familiarity that pulled them for miles, until they found Crestwood Hollow, and Sylvie, listening, knew, with a certainty that could not be reasoned with, that the silver wolf had led them again, not randomly, but purposefully, just as he had long ago for Shadow, for Elijah, for her, and now for Milo. And in Knox, Sylvie saw a fire that had not been extinguished by cruelty or starvation, but refined by it, and she began to train them both, Milo as a handler, and Knox as a search dog. But more than that, she taught them the language of trust, of stillness, of walking forward, even when the past clawed at your ankles. And the town, now familiar with such miracles cloaked in the ordinary, welcomed them as their own. And though Milo smiled rarely at first, something about the rhythm of days at Silver Watch began to loosen the sorrow from his chest. And soon he laughed freely, especially when playing with younger pups, or helping the newer handlers learn how to read body language. And yet, the wolf returned not often, but enough seen once on the ridge by Daniel, now fully retired, but still sharp-eyed and reflective, who had gone walking near the crash site and returned shaken, saying, "He's watching again," and again by Harper, who, standing in the kitchen late one night, glanced up from her tea to see a pale shape moving through the trees with a kind of grace that left tears in her eyes and a whisper on her lips. "Thank you." And eventually, by Elijah himself, though not in vision, but in dream, a dream so vivid and warm that when he woke, the scent of pine and wet fur still lingered in the air, and he knew it wasn't memory, but visitation. And in that dream, Shadow had stood beside the silver wolf, their eyes locked on his, no words spoken, but 1,000 truths passed between them, like the way stars speak to oceans. And he wept, not from grief, but from the fullness of having loved something so holy that it echoed into eternity. And in the years that followed, more children arrived, some from troubled homes, others simply lost in ways they couldn't articulate. And the dogs always knew which ones to approach, which ones to sit beside silently, which ones needed their warmth, and which ones needed to run. And the stories grew, not legends, but lived truths of how the dogs found people who had given up, how they lay beside the dying and comforted the grieving, how one girl claimed her dog had led her to a hidden cave where she found the necklace her mother had worn before vanishing years ago. And no one questioned the impossible anymore, because once a dog had begged the police for help and shut down an entire highway to save a boy's life, everything afterward was simply a continuation of that story, like ripples from the original splash. And eventually, Sylvie began to write them down, not just her father's journals, which she preserved like scripture, but new stories from her generation, from the children and dogs and moments that made up their daily lives. And she called them Moonlit Muzzle Stories, a humble title at he did. And as she radioed for help, the silver wolf vanished once more into the trees. No sound, no trail, just gone like mist in morning sun. And when the others arrived, and the woman was lifted into a stretcher and carried back toward safety, Elijah pulled Sylvie aside and asked what happened. And she told him honestly, without embellishment, and he didn't question it. He only knelt, hugged her tightly, and whispered, "He found you worthy." And they walked back in silence, hand in hand, Rune padding quietly beside them. And that night, beneath the stars, Elijah wrote in his journal, the one he kept all these years, filled with memories of shadow and the stories he never told aloud, and penned the final line, "The story never ends."